This month, my friend Matt and I made our first game together for the 2022 GMTK Game Jam. We had a weekend to make a game to the theme Roll of the Dice, and after a long, stressful 50 hours of work, we released Gamble and Die. Here's the story of how that happened and what we learnt along the way.
Yeah, so the initial idea that we had was for the Dice Dungeon Crawler, which is actually an idea that you had with somebody else previously. It just so happened to fit into the dice theme.
Yeah, it was about a year ago. Stupidly enough, it was based on another idea that I had for a story. So this idea goes back a really long time. The idea of that game was going to be more like an RPG where you would go between dungeons, collect dice, and you would decide the modifiers for that dungeon based on dice rolls. So it would be things like the enemy strength, enemy density, like hazards, and weather was going to be one of the ideas we had. I really liked that idea at the time, but we never made anything from it. So when it came to Roll of the Dice, my immediate first thought was that idea that we had a year ago.
Yeah, and we only made a few changes to make it fit the game jam better. It was pretty much the same as you pitched it to me in the first place otherwise. So the other idea that we had was for a rolling puzzle. So the dice would roll around on some tiles and you'd have to get the specific number on the goal tile. And this is one that I'm really glad we didn't do, because in the 20 or so games that I ended up rating, I played 3 that were this exact idea. They weren't bad or anything, but I don't think I would have been able to think of puzzle designs interesting enough to make it work. And I think that's why we dropped it pretty quick, because we were like, can either of us design puzzles? And we're like, no.
Yeah, especially in such a short time frame, having to think about puzzles, it just wasn't really what I was interested in doing. I would rather make a game that worked and, have a complete set of gameplay features.
Mm-hmm.
Another idea we had was you'd play as a character with some kind of dodge roll, and the roll would have random outcomes, which, again, actually did see quite a few like that, a few sort of RPGs where you roll and you get a different weapon based on the face that you rolled on.
And I kind of took that idea into the last idea we had for the game, which was going to be a shmup with a dodge roll. And when power-ups come down on the screen, you do your dodge roll over them, the dice rolls, and something happens. You get a different ability, or it changes something about how the game works, which seems probably, in retrospect, a better idea in terms of the general scope that it would entail, I think.
Yeah, completely agree that, in retrospect, given the result of the game we actually made, that probably would have been the best idea to do. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that if we ever have, a free moment to do it, we should probably make that.
Yeah, it is actually a pretty interesting idea. I can think of a lot of things to do with it.
My hang-up with the idea was that we didn't want to just make a game that was a generic game and put some random thing on it. Although, again, in retrospect, that's kind of what the game ended up being anyway. So if we were going to do that, we should have done it with the shmup idea instead of what we did.
Yeah, and I think the thing about the shmup idea is I think it's a lot quicker to implement and get things working, to sort of decide how much the roles do specifically change. There would have been probably a lot more chances to actually play test it than we definitely ended up having on the game that we made.
Completely agree.
So we ended up fleshing out the Dice Dungeon Crawler idea. So the very first idea we had, we ended up going with, but we had a lot more ideas for what we wanted to do than what we actually ended up putting in the game.
Yeah, so the concept that we put together was going to be, it was a shooter. There were different rooms and enemies would spawn in the room. In each room there would be a door that you had to unlock by collecting a certain number of dice. And at the time you could only carry the required number of dice. And then when you finished a room, you would be given a screen where you were shown modifiers that you could control with dice rolls. We were going to have bosses every few levels, and there were going to be chests and items in chests, and a lot of that just didn't make it.
Yeah, especially because there's quite a lot of hubris in the original concept of the game, because I think originally it wasn't going to be random. We were going to have specifically 20 levels with 4 bosses between each of the 5 levels you go through. And considering we didn't implement bosses at all, maybe a bit overly confident.
Yeah, at one point it sort of became endless because we just didn't have the time to put bosses in, and rather than having to faff about with a set number of levels, just let it go on forever.
Yeah, which I think, given the time we had and like the constraints and everything, probably was the best shout.
So the first thing I got done was just a basic character controller with 8 directional movement and shooting with like a little gun that sort of spins around the character when you're aiming. And you put together some character design.
Yeah, it was the very first thing I did. Obviously, the character is the thing you're going to spend the most time looking at, so considering the sheer number of things I thought I was going to have to make, I wanted to make it simple enough so the art style wouldn't look really out of place. But when I made the Joker as the 4th character, you pretty much said to me, this looks way better than the other ones that I'd already made, which led me to do them again. Which I'm glad I did, because I took the time to actually give them an actual walking animation instead of the weird robed shuffle that they did before.
So when we decided to have 4 characters, one of the first things that I set up was having these 4 characters essentially set up as templates. And it might look like that would have taken a long time, but it didn't. But maybe we shouldn't have had so many characters, because having all of these characters meant that we needed a character select screen, which never got fully integrated. It meant that we had the multiple guns that didn't really all work very well. The shotgun especially is just way too powerful.
Yeah, I think the main thing I think we both learned from this whole experience is no matter how easy it is to implement a specific idea, it's that every idea you implement has like a knock-on effect to everything else. Like you said, you have to do the character select screen, but it's also like making the levels, balancing the levels to like each of the weapons and characters and everything like that. So yeah, I definitely think even though it was a pretty quick thing for you to implement and you made it quite like modular, I definitely think we probably should have focused on maybe like 1 or 2 instead.
Yeah, and I did other modular things too. Like, I set it so that bullets have the option to have ricochet, which is only used for the shotgun and one of the enemies, and it's just not worth the time I spent on it, even if it's only a short amount of time.
Yeah, there are a lot of like clever things that you did in terms of making things modular, but because of how much time we had and ended up allocating for each thing, we didn't end up changing them anyway, because we didn't have time to test and change those things.
Yeah, it would have been great for testing if we were just decided to tweak some values, but that just didn't happen.
Yeah, you'd like design things in a way where we would have been able to test it, being like, oh no, this doesn't work exactly, and then, you know, change it a little. But spoiler alert, we didn't test anything, basically at all, because we didn't have time.
Basically, I tested it whilst I was working on it is the closest we ever got to testing. Speaking of things that were relatively quick to implement that we just shouldn't have done, the next thing that I worked on was a level generator. I built some other project a while ago. I think it was some sort of breakout clone that took a PNG and generated a layout for the blocks based on this PNG. And I thought, I can do that for these levels. It will make it so that we can add levels easily. I think I said when we were talking about choosing from a selection of levels at random, we could make 60 levels or something ridiculous like that. And yeah, maybe if we started literally the day that we started the jam, but we didn't even start actually making levels until like an hour or two before the deadline.
Yeah, it was 2 hours before, yeah. Ada was so busy doing everything like programming wise. She was like, oh, Matt, you have to make these levels. I was like, okay, I'll make these levels. And it was quick to make them. But because I didn't really have any idea about how the game worked, the design, really how big things were going to be, you can sort of see that the levels vary very differently in terms of like the size that they actually are. It ended up being that some levels are just sort of massive rooms, some like you walk for like a few seconds and you're on the other side of the level. So it's really it's balanced quite poorly, to put it lightly. So another problem with like the levels and how they were sort of designed, with everything being like a specific color, is that all the levels are really barren as well. I didn't know how to really implement like props or other things into the level, so they are just kind of walls and a massive space of carpet with like nothing else to really distinguish anything from anything else. But when I made the rooms originally, this is when we were still thinking that we were going to have chests in the game as well. So some levels are like, say it's a room or a hallway where there's some enemies in the front and there's a chest in the back. So the chest is like the green pixel, but it doesn't actually work because there are no chests in the game. So they're just sort of random rooms there's no point in going into.
Yeah, the only point is to go in to kill the enemies in the hopes that they drop a dice that you need.
Yeah, and because of how much ended up spawning, didn't really matter anyway.
Yeah.
Which we'll talk about a bit later. So I think directly after making the player characters, or even before, I think the very first thing I made was a mock-up for what I wanted the poker chip enemy to be, where the markings on the edges of the poker chip sort of show where the bullet pattern is going to go. So they were a pretty quick implementation, but I remember after the very first enemy, coming up with the other two that we ended up having, with only one actually getting into the game, it's actually pretty hard.
Yeah, I mean, the poker chip seemed like a really obvious choice thematically and also as a game. You had the multiple different difficulties with different firing patterns. It felt perfect. You obviously wanted some sort of shmup element in there to have enemies with like crazy firing patterns. The other enemies we ended up doing were the card shuffler and the domino man. We only have artwork for the Domino Man because he didn't make it into the game, but we were able to add the card shuffler, which is sort of like a turret that shoots cards at you.
Yeah, and the way that ended up sort of playing out in the game is because they do a whole 360 rotation, half the time they're not looking at you, and then even when they are, they're so slow that it's very hard to get hit by them.
Yeah, and there was some problems that I had with that where they weren't always detecting the player properly. So there was probably an issue where you could be right next to it and it still wouldn't shoot you.
The domino enemy was supposed to be, I guess, the only thing that would directly like come at you, like charge at you. They're just supposed to like kind of walk up to you and, I don't know, they do damage by being there. We didn't get to think about it that much. Originally, I wanted to have it so maybe they like fall over, that's like their attack. But at this point, we sort of knew that we were running quite light on time. That was like, I won't put that bit in. But unfortunately, the little funny boys didn't end up getting in at all.
Yeah, and all of the enemies suffer from problems with their AI to some degree as well. They all have very small areas of detection, so you can basically always shoot them from off screen or outside of their range. I watched a friend of mine play it and he didn't even see the enemies shoot until I told him to, stop so he could actually see the animations.
I feel like, at least from my point of view, it's pretty safe to say that AI in general was probably one of the main struggles that you had, right?
Yeah, I had to stop after the end of the first day early because I was trying to get this AI done and stressing over it not working the way I wanted it to. And it was silly because I was lying in bed at night not able to get to sleep because I'd realized, oh, I know exactly what to do. I know exactly how to fix it. And yeah, then, the next morning I got up and I did it, but it still never worked quite the way that I wanted it to.
Yeah, I think when you're sort of just sitting there, bashing your head against the wall, you really do just need some time to, like, come away from it for a bit and be like, okay, how actually would this work, rather than just sort of, I don't know, I feel like you get tunnel vision, like you don't get to see the bigger picture.
Although a positive I'll take from this is that I have actually learned a lot more about doing AI from this.
Originally, the idea was that it was supposed to be, say you have a room, and to get through the next door, you need at least 3 dice. Originally, we wanted to have it so you can only carry those 3 dice at a time, so whichever modifiers you get for the next room, you don't know, and maybe you have good dice for it, maybe you have bad, maybe you want a high roll, maybe you want a low roll. But because of problems we had with how many dice actually spawn, this was a problem that we had a lot later on. So we had to make it a really quick fix as well. So we just sort of had to shove as many dice as we could. I think you doubled the drop rates for them.
Yeah, so there was some sort of bug where enemies didn't always drop the number of dice you needed, so I just wanted to guarantee that you could at least get through the level and play the game.
Mm-hmm.
So I doubled the number of dice that enemies were guaranteed to drop.
Yeah, and then even having the system of being able to, like, swap dice, say, in your inventory, we didn't have time to do. So I think this is an example of, like, one of those concepts that, like, because we got rid of it, the game still, like, it technically works, but one of the, like, core concepts of the game we didn't really get to implement properly, because when you actually play the game, you have so many dice. There's not really any real choice.
Yeah, we wanted the game to be about making the best of what you have, and because you always had everything, it didn't matter. A friend of mine played it and didn't even realize that you lose the dice you don't use between levels, because every level they would always get back the dice they wanted.
Yeah, and like playing through the game the first time, I remember like killing one enemy and getting 5 dice from it. And it was like, well, okay, I can just go straight to the exit now.
Which is like a completely separate bug. I don't even understand how, because the enemies aren't programmed to carry multiple dice. They're only programmed to have one at a time. So I'm not even sure how that ever came to be.
Yeah, I think it was because, just something that you had to change last minute, so it ended up having like probably some other knock-on effect that broke something else about the drop rates and everything.
Yeah, this was proper 11th hour stuff. We just didn't have the time to look at it, and it worked, so whatever.
Yeah, the drops in general as well, like the health drops you added in like last minute as well, and it kind of breaks the game and how it works, because it's pretty much impossible to lose unless you're like really trying, because basically every enemy drops health.
Yeah, so that was a mistake that I made, like you say, at the very last minute, where we already had the dice dropping and the coins dropping, and I wanted to add healing items dropping just so that you did have the opportunity to heal. The way that money dropping worked by doing multiple random roll checks to see, does this enemy have money that spawns on its death? And it would go through multiple checks where it becomes less and less likely through each of the checks. So the idea was that all enemies would drop some money, but some enemies would drop more money. And I copied the same code for the health drops, but rather than making health drops the like less likely roll to happen, I accidentally made them the most likely to happen. And I'm pretty sure they always drop healing items. Something I am really proud of, though, is the screen for rolling the dice against the different modifiers. We initially had plans to put in loads of modifiers, but we only actually ended up putting in 3 of them. There was enemy density, enemy strength, and loot rarity. only 2 of those actually work as well. Enemy density and loot rarity do something, but enemy power or strength doesn't actually modify anything about the game.
Yeah, and loot rarity doesn't actually work in the way that, at least when I played the game, I assumed it did. I assumed it affected like all loot that would drop, so rarity of the dice, right? Like the higher the dice or how many dice drop. But I think it's just money, you said, and I didn't know that until like several times after I'd already played through the game.
Yeah, so all it does at the moment is it just gives you more money based on the loot rarity roll that you got. I think it's literally just a multiplication for, you know, if you got a 20 in loot rarity, you get 20 per coin instead of 1 per coin. But the way the screen worked was that it would randomly pick from the modifiers that you had available, and then you would drag the dice from your inventory into the empty slot and roll the dice. And it was the first time I'd ever done a sort of drag and drop interface in Godot, and I was really pleased with how it turned out and actually how easy it was. And something I thought was really clever about the dice rolling was that we had 5 dice, D4, D6, D8, D12 and D20, and the way we treated the numbers for each roll was that a 4 on a D4 is the equivalent to a 4 on any other dice, rather than a 4 being the equivalent to the max roll on any other dice. The idea was supposed to be that in any situation where you specifically wanted a low roll, you would use one of the lower roll dice. And in a situation where you wanted a high roll, you would use the high roll dice. Problem is, because you got so many, it didn't really matter.
Yeah, and on top of that as well, like, because of how the game is kind of designed and how easy it is, most of the rolls don't really matter anyway. You can sort of roll 20s on everything and it's still kind of a cakewalk and doesn't really impact things all that much.
If anything, people who played it actually preferred rolling like really high numbers on enemy density because it was more fun to have lots of enemies, which was something I wasn't even really thinking about. I was thinking that you'd want to make it easier on yourself by giving you less enemies, but that's the sort of thing I guess you get tunnel vision and you don't even consider how people are going to play the game that you're making.
Yeah, when I ended up playing, I was exactly the same way. I was just like the highest rolls I possibly can on basically everything, but especially enemy density, because that's the only thing in the game that you can see like a sort of direct change. I thought maybe if people were going to do, you know, highest rolls for everything, it'd be like someone really wanted to go for like a very high score or something like that, but just because of how the game plays normally, yeah, you're just sort of incentivized almost to just make it as hard as you possibly can.
And all of this with the modifiers and the rolling screen and the dice themselves, I did that in a few hours before you'd even woken up on Saturday.
Yeah, I think it was one of those mornings I was just very surprised that like, oh, it's like, look how much I've done. It's like, oh yeah, it's all shaping up. It's going to be perfect, smooth sailing. No problems are going to happen. Definitely. Surely not.
And it was that same day that it just all went to despair as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, everything just fell apart.
It was so positive that morning, and then by the end of the day, it was just, oh shit, the enemies don't work.
Yeah, I feel like for the most, like 80% of the game jam, we were in high spirits. It's like, oh, you know, it's all going well. There were like a few things that, you know, a few little dips, but it was like, oh, you know, it's going to go well. Everything's going to turn out exactly how we wanted. Maybe with a couple concessions, but yeah, then there was just like this point where I was like, oh shit, man, I don't think this game's going to work properly. can't get the enemies working, can't get this working. It's all going to shit, Matt.
I was depressed and tired, and I genuinely don't think I ate on the Sunday at all as well, which wasn't healthy.
Jesus. Yeah, definitely one of the other takeaways, besides of what we have already discussed, is maybe getting a takeaway. Woo. Cut that out. So the bosses that we mentioned that we were originally going to have, we had 4 ideas for, I guess, the 20 levels that we originally wanted to have. The first one was the roulette wheel, which I did end up designing and animating, had the whole idea for what I wanted it to be. He was going to spin for a number, that number would damage him that amount, then he'd spawn a wave of enemies, you kill a wave of enemies, and he keeps spinning. That keeps like going on in a loop. The next one was going to be a card shark, so you're playing a game of blackjack, which may be a little ambitious in retrospect, considering the amount of time that we had. So I made the whole deck of cards, which I kind of cheated for, but you know, I still spent time making them.
I was most concerned about getting the rules of blackjack into a boss fight. I just didn't really have any idea where to go with programming that, especially considering that, you know, most of the game was pretty simple up to that point, just bullets and enemies moving.
Yeah, it was one of those things that, I guess, not being a programmer at all, it's very much like, well, the rules of blackjack are pretty easy. You know, I could explain them to you and everything and how it's supposed to work. But yeah, I think in terms of actually implementing it, it's a lot harder, I think, than it sounds on paper. The other two ideas were for a slot machine and like a pachinko game. These didn't really ended up getting fleshed out at all. We just sort of wrote the ideas down. And by the time it actually came to doing anything with them, we were like, we do not have enough time to do any of this. So I didn't like waste time actually doing anything for it at that point.
We realized about halfway through the second day that we were just never gonna get any of the bosses in. If we did, it probably would have been the roulette wheel. And that definitely felt like the most fleshed out boss in terms of the artwork you've done and the idea. But unfortunately, I was still rushing to get the enemies done at that point, so I just couldn't dedicate the time to a boss for a boss fight we weren't even sure was going to happen.
Yeah, this is exactly when we talked about the idea of like, we should make this an endless game, because if we're not going to have bosses in at all, then we need something else for like the gameplay loop.
So it was really hard, took basically to the very end of the allotted time, but we just managed to get a working game, right? We had level generation with multiple levels that Matt had designed. We had the characters, all worked, all had different guns with slightly different behaviors. We had enemies, only 2 enemies with 3 variants for the poker chips and 2 variants for the card shufflers. And we had maybe an hour left on the deadline before we actually decided, let's just post this now. There's nothing we can do in the time we have left that's going to make a significant difference. So we build the game, we get it uploaded onto itch, and we relax. And then I think, oh, I'll just, play it whilst we're waiting for the time to end, and realized that it didn't work.
Yeah, you'd sent it over to me as well. You're like, oh, give it a try. The very first time I actually get to play the game, click on like the character that I want to play, and I'm just getting like a huge list of error messages, and the game crashes immediately. And I think that the exact same thing happened on your end as well, right?
Yeah, so luckily we sort of had an idea where the problem was. Matt had made a level shortly before that where he'd forgot to put any doors on the level design.
Oh yeah, I forgot I did that.
And all it meant was that the player wouldn't spawn at any of the doors, so they would just be in an empty void. That's what I could see on my debug version, where it wouldn't crash, it would just report all of the errors, and then you'd be the character in an empty void. So I knew that the error had something to do with loading levels, but I just had no idea. It was working absolutely fine in debug mode, but not working in the final build, and I was panicking at this point. It must have been like half an hour before the deadline before we realized that the game just didn't work. You could not play it.
Yeah, because when I actually ended up, I was like, oh, here's the new level. Just 2 little yellow pixels to add in the doors. Phew, job done, all sorted. And then the problem just sort of expanded from there, because it definitely still did not work.
Both of us were Googling these errors, trying to find what the problem was. I had an idea, it was something to do with loading files, and I just didn't understand why it wasn't loading these files for the levels. And I wish that I could say, oh, it was this thing that fixed it, but honestly, to this day, I still don't know what actually fixed the error. I must have re-imported these files a bunch of times in different ways. Instead of loading the files as an array from the folder they were in, I just manually put the paths for each of the files into an array. There were all sorts of things I did, and none of them seemed to work until maybe 10 minutes before the deadline, where I just decided I'm gonna do another build and see if that works. And it did. So then with 10 minutes to the deadline, we rushed to get it uploaded as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I remember just the feeling of dread when it was like 10 minutes left and you were just saying, I don't think this is happening, we're not going to be able to upload. And just that feeling of like the last 48 hours of pretty much constant work while we were awake being like unplayable. I can't think of many other times in my life I felt like a specific emotion like that. It was pretty rough.
Yeah, it was not good, to say the least. I mean, we were already pretty burnt out by that point, and it just added on top of the burnout to just think that all of that time was wasted. And going back to what we said earlier about the knock-on effect of trying to do something clever, if we didn't do level generation with PNG files or whatever, we wouldn't have had that bug. Sure, we might have had to spend more time putting levels together, but it would have worked.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was just the moment I'd like become fully dejected and like was beginning to like work on accepting that this game was never going to happen. That was when the like 15th thing that you actually ended up trying finally worked, yeah.
And it was all hands on deck at that point. It was quick, get it uploaded, send it to me as well so I can test it, you said.
Yeah, get the page working, get like everything uploaded onto the page. I'm still so glad that the game actually ended up coming out for all its shortcomings. I'm still really proud of us.
Absolutely, yeah. And despite the fact that we had to make all of these compromises, the game works. People played it.
Yeah.
Some people actually liked it.
Yeah, a surprising number of people. I remember saying in the first place when, it was getting towards the end and I was like, I'd be happy if we even got like a single comment, because how the system works is people kind of have to rate the lowest rated game, so you've sort of guaranteed a certain number of ratings, but nobody has to take the time to leave a comment and like let you know what worked, what didn't, what they thought. So it was actually quite touching that so many people actually ended up leaving feedback for us.
Unfortunately, we did actually still ship with one bug, which was on the screen where you are given the modifiers and roll a dice against the modifiers. If you didn't drop a dice into one of the empty slots and just clicked the roll button, it would crash the game.
Yeah, I think that was something one of my friends that I sent it to noticed pretty much immediately. And again, one of the comments that was left, it was a cool idea for a game, but as soon as you roll this thing, it just doesn't work at all. It just crashes immediately, so can't really comment much on how good the game is.
A friend of mine said he liked it, even though he had that same issue where he...
I like that one level.
He got to the roll and just thought, oh, it crashed. What's up with that? But it's fun.
Yeah, and because it is one of those things that you did put instructions on the screen for it. Because it was a screen that we were like, we'll change this in a bit. We'll make it like more clear and everything for what you have to do. Because we were so to the wire on everything, it was like, well, we had to kind of ship it as is, and the bug just sort of made it more unfortunate that if people didn't notice what they had to do, it yeah, it just didn't work.
Yeah, the little bit of text that says what you have to do is like right at the bottom of the screen. And actually, it might even be that it's off screen depending on like the size you have the game.
Oh, I didn't know that. I definitely saw it playing, but obviously me playing it, it's a bit different because I know what I have to do.
Yeah, see, a friend of mine played it. It was cut off on the bottom on his view when he had the screen a certain size, which I wasn't sure could happen because I thought that it was set to just scale. So I don't know if that was just something dodgy with what he was doing or if that's actually a common issue.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I definitely didn't have that on my end, but it's one of those things that didn't have time to really test if that did happen in the first place. So
what do we think the most important thing we're going to take away from this experience is?
it's probably that we need to sort out a minimum viable product first to actually test and iterate off it, which is why we said that the shmup idea is probably the better one, rather than this where we were just sort of rushing to try and pin all our ideas together as fast as we could. So pretty soon after we got finished with the game, I remember asking you if you'd want to like fix these problems that we had, and I think at the time you were so burnt out, you didn't say no. You were like, oh, maybe at some point, yeah, we'll see. That's definitely the vibe that I got, that it was like, you didn't have the heart to tell me that you were so burnt out, you didn't want to have anything to do with this game anymore.
Yeah, at the time, I just never wanted to see a dice ever again. But I meant it when I said, I wasn't too sure, I just wanted to see, but having thought about it, I am more than happy actually to say, yeah, let's make a better version of this game. Let's improve on it.
Yeah, we've already made like a list and plenty of things we want to change and kind of completely overhaul, do way differently, which I think is what we're going to do after what we have planned for next month, which is called the Low Res Jam. It's a game jam where the game that you make has to be 64 by 64 pixels. You get 2 weeks to do it this time instead of the measly 48 hours that we had. So we're going to go at a much better pace. You're going to be able to eat and not have to worry about slaving away to make something. But I think the game itself, when we're generally thinking about the kind of thing we're going to do, is probably going to be like smaller scale, both I guess artistically and scope of the game as well. A much simpler idea that we can maybe build on if we have time, right?
Yeah, I'm hoping that we can take, the core things that we've learned from this game jam and apply it to that one. And I think given that we've got a much larger window of time to do development on it, it's not unreasonable to think that we should be able to apply all of the things that we've talked about today, all of the problems we had, and make sure we don't make those mistakes again.
Yeah, so hopefully August's episode should be this game jam, how well we did, how everything we learned got funneled into this game and it's literally perfect and we win first place. And the month after should be, the upgraded version of Gamble and Die, which you should also be able to play and kind of compare to the original version to see what we learned and how we could apply it to the game to sort of make it the original vision that we had for it.